my name is Dora Kampis, and I'm very happy for this opportunity to be here today and to tell you about my project, the topic of which is the role of infants' emerging self-perspective in memory development. Humans are exceptional in their ability to remember events from their lives as one-time, unrepeatable episodes. This type of remembering is called episodic memory. And memories formed this way shape our identity and are important for our social relationships. We learn most things through individual events. For example, all of us at some point learned that whales are sea mammals, but it's unlikely we remember where we learned this. However, if we learned it on a memorable whale watching trip, then we will bind to this memory also the details of how, where, and when we came to know it. But remembering these details can be very effortful. So why would our brains store them? Besides their importance for our personal history, these memories have a role in our social lives when we want to argue for why we think something is true. So if I forget that I promised to pick up the kids from daycare, then my partner might remind me of the event when we were discussing it and how we came to our agreement. And the more details he will recall, the more we will both be convinced that he is right. This also means that we may remember better when we see things differently, in case it becomes relevant later. But despite the importance of this type of memories in our everyday lives, how and why in development this capacity emerges is still a puzzle to date. So try and think back to your earliest memory. It will be probably from early kindergarten, maybe late daycare, but unlikely before your 3rd birthday, as for most adults if we ask them. So from this, it may seem that episodic memory suddenly appears after age 3. But memories don't appear overnight. So what is changing in young children's cognition? So in developmental psychology, the past couple of decades have brought us ample of evidence that refined our understanding of these first few years. And one lesson, more generally, that we have learned is that babies know a lot more than we might think just by looking at them or observing them. So for example, while they don't have this type of episodic type memory, or we can't recall our earliest years, babies in fact remember quite a lot about knowledge, facts that they store, and they also remember some events from their lives. And in one seminal study, researchers studied this by binding a little thread to babies' legs that, when they kicked, then operated this little mobile that was above them. So of course babies liked this, and when they started to notice this, they kicked more and more. And interestingly, if then, first of all, babies also continued to kick when the mobile was away, but also, importantly, when sometime later they were presented with this again, then they started to kick earlier, faster. So this meant that they remembered some things about what happened then, right? We also know that from early on, infants take part in interactions and explore the world with others around them. Others around them are also a rich source of information, and babies use this actively. For example, they often point to things when they want to know something, so we provide information for them. And while originally it was thought that babies don't understand much about other people's internal states, in fact, by now we know that that's not true, and in fact they understand quite a bit about other people's thoughts, and in particular that people are governed by their thoughts, so they act based on what they think is true and not necessarily what is actually true. But how can we ask a baby without words? How can we study the infant mind? So by now, there's a really wide range of methods, from very clever behavioral paradigms to technologically complicated neuroimaging methods. But really, one of the first and the most basic, simplest thing to do is to record how long a baby is attending to something. And this capitalizes on the fact that we tend to look longer at things that we find more interesting, for example, because it violates our expectations. So for example, we can show babies 2 types of events. And in one event, there's an object that goes behind an occluder, and then this occluder moves and reveals this object. Now there's a movement in here, so a baby will likely attend to this, but it's not particularly surprising. If we contrast this with an event where the object goes behind the occluder, and then the occluder reveals an empty space, now this is weird, this shouldn't happen. And indeed, what researchers found repeatedly is that babies attend to these events with longer attention. They look longer to this kind of events, which in this case tells us that they have expectations about the physical world. Objects don't just disappear. And this method was also used to gain insights into infant social cognition. So in this seminal study, the researchers showed infants a person who observed these. There were two boxes in front of her, and this melon-shaped object that she saw went into one of the boxes, the green one. Then she disappeared for a while, and while she was away, this melon went into the other side, into the other box. Then she came back, and babies saw one of two types of outcomes. So in one type of outcome, she reached to the green box for this object. Now, this is consistent with her false belief, but that is not actually where the object is. In the other case, she reached into the yellow box, which is where it really is, but is inconsistent with her false belief. So really here we contrast reality, what the infants know, and what her belief is. And what they found was that infants look longer when she reached, which was inconsistent with her belief, despite the fact that this was actually correct. She actually found the object here. And so this told us that infants had expectations about what she will do based on her subjective mental state. So this and other studies have, from the last few decades, gave us a lot of evidence that infants from early on understand quite a bit about other people's mental lives. So is it the case that babies just then know everything and there's nothing that happens in development? Well, of course, this is not the case. And in fact, when we see interesting mistakes they make or how they think differently is what informs our theories best. So from the past decades of research, we also found some interesting limitations of infants' thinking. For example, they seem to track the perspectives and mental states of others, but often don't bind this to the person. So what do I mean by this? If I tell you that I like broccoli more than cupcakes, or you see me choosing repeatedly broccoli over cupcake, you will conclude Dora likes broccoli more. But you won't just go around and offer broccoli to everyone, thinking that they like broccoli as well. So we tend to think about mental states like preferences as bound to that particular person. But when we probe this in 10-month-old babies, this is not what we found. And in fact, what we found was this image is incorrect, but what we showed them first is there was a person who chose one of two objects. And then we showed them two kinds of outcomes with a new person. The new person either chose the same object or she chose a different object. And what we found was that babies looked longer when she chose the different object, which tells us that they expected this new person to choose the same. So they didn't bind this preference of the first person to her, but generalize this to a new one. So young babies seem to have limitations in that they don't bind the perspective of a person to that person specifically. In other paradigms, we found that others' perspectives influence infants' behavior even when it seemingly shouldn't. So here we use the paradigm when we show babies a box, hide an object in there, and plenty of other research previously has found that when there's an object in this box, babies search in the box, and they search longer when they think something is in there compared to when they think it's empty. And what we did was we changed it into a social setting, and we introduced a person who falsely believed that there's an object in there, but babies knew it was empty. And what we found across repeated variations of this paradigm is that babies searched longer when the other person believed that there's still an object in the box, despite the fact that they knew there was nothing anymore. So young babies, while they keep the tracked perspective of others, they have trouble with delineating who knows what, who thinks what, with this sort of contrasting their own and others' perspective. And this is not surprising, considering the fact that researchers argued that a concept of self only gradually emerges over the second year of life. So what is a concept of self? Broadly speaking, it is an awareness of myself as distinct from others, or that one's thoughts, memories, or perspective may not be the same as that of others. So the self undergoes important changes in these years. And again, in light of these, it is unsurprising that infants' memory also has important limitations. In particular, it is not flexible in regard to the type of information they store. They don't store some of the specifics. They don't bind these details to these memories. So episodic memory also undergoes important changes. So previously, these considerations from social cognition in the early years have been considered separately from episodic memory. And in my project, I would like to integrate these. And at the core of my proposal is an integrative theory linking the emergence of self-concept and the consequent perspective contrast to episodic memory development. So we will study infants across these ages to identify the role of the emerging self-concept in the development of episodic memory, to understand what conditions allow binding details to memories, and what might be factors that shape memory development. So I propose that the emergence of episodic memory is linked to milestones in early social cognition. So while young babies don't bind perspectives to people, so for example, they remember what was seen, but not who saw it, I suggest that the emerging self-concept gives infants an understanding or a contrast between their own perspective and that of others. So for example, this is how I see this object, and that's how you see this object, or this is my belief or preference, and that's yours. But this contrast also brings about an important challenge, how to reconcile these, how to reconcile this contrasting information. And the solution to this challenge will be to bind the perspective to the individual. And this binding to the self, so remembering, okay, this is what I saw, or understanding this is my perspective, will further highlight the self-perspective, further highlighting the perspective contrast, and so on. So this iterative process I propose will eventually lead to children mastering how to keep track of different perspectives. And tracking these over time requires remembering perspectives bound to people, which is how this is inherently linked to binding memories to their sources. So in my project, 2 cross-sectional studies will study the link between perspective, contrast, and binding. These will test the hypotheses whether children who show a concept of self will bind details to their memories, and whether better binding is indeed related to perceiving perspective contrast. A longitudinal study will track these developmental milestones within the individual and test whether the self-concept and binding predict episodic memory. So for example, in children who show an earlier emerging self-concept, we might expect episodic memory to emerge earlier as well. And we also know that infants are not alone in this developmental process. So we will also study how parent-child interactions might influence, might facilitate this process. So what are the methods that we'll be using? So some of them I already mentioned, but we'll be using behavioral methods. For example, a well-established measure of the self-concept is to see if infants recognize themselves in a mirror. We will use looking patterns, so longer looking to an event as an indicator of surprise, as well as brain responses, for example, to identify markers of correct or incorrect recall, or perceiving a conflict between perspectives. And importantly, we can combine these in real time and record them in the individual. For example, in this study, we will ask if babies bind a preference to this first person, so she chooses one of 2 objects, or will they expect this new person to choose the same one? And here at the same time, new technology allows us to record simultaneously where they're looking, which is the purple dot that you see, how long they attend to these events, and at the same time, how their brain responds to observing these events. Later, we can also probe what they themselves choose or what they remember about these objects. So this study, the project will take place at the Center for Early Childhood Cognition at the University of Copenhagen, where we have our lab. And this is where we invite families. And these visits from the infant's perspective is just like any other scenario that they might partake in their everyday lives. So they play with things, they interact with people, or they watch a cartoon or watch a movie. But for us, it allows us to make inferences about their thinking. So with this project, I hope to identify the causal links in development that contribute to the emergence of episodic memory. We will create a framework integrating social cognition and memory development, and by this, provide an understanding that links these domains and inspire future theories, policies, and can be the seed for interventions. The team will consist of myself as PI and 2 postdocs who will be hired and working at the University of Copenhagen. And the project will benefit of consultations from 2 collaborators, Carla Holmboe, who is an expert in longitudinal design, and Josephine Ross, who studies the development of self-concept and episodic memory. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who helped me put this project together and who will help me make it happen, DFF for funding it, and thank you for your attention.